Hey everybody, welcome back. This is round 2 of Q&A with Dr. Mark Bowers. I'm glad you're here joining us, and I hope you will follow or subscribe because we're going to be doing these every week. And we continue to get a nice volume of questions, really insightful, thought-provoking topics here to share with you today. So let's just jump right in, shall we? I love this one. What are some of the first or early signs of autism? And, this is one of my pet peeves too, because I find that so many people, maybe it's just less aware of, the actuality of what autism looks like. A lot of people get really fixated and focused on eye contact. I even have had people get really fixated about tiptoe walking. And while those might be signs, early signs of autism, those in and of themselves, whether you have it or you don't, is really immaterial, right? So there are a lot of kids who walk on their toes for a variety of different reasons, and there are a lot of kids that don't make eye contact for a lot of different reasons. What I try to do beyond the diagnostic criteria, which would kind of be a waste of time because you guys can just Google it and look it up. But we try to think of what the way I try to think about it is 3 S's and 2 R's. So the S's are sensory profile, the social profile, and the speech profile. And the 2 R's are they rigid and are they repetitive? And if we can sort of hone in on those 5 areas, we're starting to kind of narrow in. And I would encourage all pediatricians to maybe utilize a similar model. I know that a lot of pediatricians now utilize the MCHAT screening checklist. Certainly that covers a lot of different signs and symptoms of early autism. But if you're seeing those 3 S's, and we're looking for not just one of those, right? We're looking for some combination of those things. And you don't have to have challenges in all 5 of those categories. But typically what we'll see early on is a speech and language delay, one of the early indicators. If we have that by itself, then yes, it's just a speech and language delay. But if we have that with then social challenges beyond speech, right? So it's not that they can't use language to connect, but how do they engage with others? How do they share things with people? Do they try to interact and engage and be reciprocal with people, or do they just kind of stay in their own worlds? And so you can start to really study the quality of the social profile. That's also going to include play-based behavior. So imaginative play is something that children with autism have a very difficult time early on kind of playing in a pretend way. They tend to play in more of a repetitive or routine way with more items or objects that are more sensory in nature, or they're more linear in nature in terms of they have a clear purpose, like a train rolls back and forth on a track, and that might become a sensory play too, right, where the child gets on the side of their head and likes to watch the wheels go across their visual field because it makes their brain happy, right? It feels good when that happens. So that would be more of the social profile. The sensory profile could be toe walking. It could be strong aversion to sounds. A child who just doesn't like tags in their clothes, I wouldn't get overly concerned about that, or the seams in their socks, because most people don't enjoy those. And most clothing companies, the savvier ones, have turned their products into tagless, where they just print the actual tag information on the inside of the material. But by itself, what we're looking for from a sensory standpoint is sensory seeking, sensory avoidance, but it has to be a pretty extreme presentation that causes problems when you're trying to navigate and get through your day and get through the world. And then the 2 R's are the repetitive, so we're looking for repetitive behaviors. That could include dominating interests too, so things like just wanting to talk about a particular topic all the time, or give people information about a topic, or to be so rigid in the routine and the schedule when plans change, when unexpected things happen, when transitions have to occur, the rigidity there. But then the repetition part too is, repetitive behaviors about things like flapping and pacing, and a lot of STEM types of behaviors are definitely covered there. So those would be some of the first and early signs of autism. Notice nowhere in there was eye contact part of that. Now, eye contact might be looked at under the social profile, just how do they use their eyes to engage. But many individuals find that sustained eye contact actually breaks concentration. And so what you may notice too is that when individuals look away and you sort of demand that they look back at you, which a lot of adults have this thing with, like, look at me when I'm talking to you, that is actually incredibly uncomfortable for somebody who's neurodivergent. And it breaks their thought process as well. So if you want to have a good conversation with someone who has a hard time modulating their eye contact, then you're going to want to kind of compromise and meet them where they're at, for sure. Forcing them to kind of look at you while they're talking is just going to interrupt their train of thought, cause frustration and stress, and you're never going to hear what their message originally was. So hopefully that answers the question, some of the first and early signs of autism. Next one, what are important bases to cover as an autistic child grows up? Guardianship, housing, independent living skills. Where do we begin and when should we start? Okay. So it depends. I mean, this is a great question. It really depends too on like schooling, for example. If the child is attending a public school, usually if there should be an IEP in place if the child has autism, and usually it depends on the track that they're on. So we have a certificate of completion track and we have a diploma track. And the children who end up on the certificate of completion track for IEPs, usually around the age of 15, we start to talk about transitional planning. And that really involves things like, if it's a certificate of completion track, job skills training, independent living skills. Here in the state of Michigan, students can continue to have their services up through the age of 26 through the school district, where they go and they do life skills training and learn all kinds of different independent living skills and job skills that can really help them as they get older. But it's important to cover independent living skills, I think, from a very early age too. I mean, we're always going to want to kind of figure out how we meet the child where they're at, but also how we can sort of help them to elevate up and to get more independence behind their behavior. If guardianship is going to be considered, we have to start to think about that at the age of majority, which is around the individual's 18th birthday, is when a lot of things change legally, as far as going to doctor appointments now require a release of information if parents want to be privy to what's discussed in that or want to be present for that meeting, or financial decision making and power and whatnot. And so what the guardianship helps to establish, and it can be done in a variety of ways, where you can do kind of a temporary guardianship. You can set it for like a year, you can do several years, or you can go for more of a permanent guardianship. Now, we would typically look at a permanent guardianship probably for level 3 autism diagnoses. For those of you familiar, we have 3 levels that we're often asked to assign with the diagnosis. Level 1 is considered the mildest, most likely to result in independent living. Level 3 means that this individual requires substantial support from others. And so if we're level 3, I would go ahead and bank on going for guardianship at the age of majority at age 18. And what that's going to do as parents or guardians, it's going to allow you to oversee things, because if there's, say, a trust that the individual is going to acquire at a certain age, maybe when they turn 21, they start getting money paid out to them from their trust, even Social Security payments coming through. What we don't want is, say this individual loves to do things online and play games. What we don't want is they're on there and then all of a sudden somebody on their game chat or Discord or something says to them, hey, I'm really strapped for cash right now, I can't even get food, could you loan me a couple $100? And what happens there is oftentimes, and I've seen it happen, people will give them the money, not being able to read the cues as well and understand that, this is a process that's beginning to now take advantage of them. And so guardianship allows you to have protections put in place. So money can't be withdrawn without parental guidance and permission, or money over a certain amount can't be withdrawn. In addition, you can do medical visits so that you can continue to provide information. I mean, oftentimes if we're talking about level 3 autism, this is an individual that's going to need a translator. He or she's going to need someone who can communicate with the medical world, with the financial world, with the occupational world, if that's applicable. And so guardianship is definitely a good thing to look into. Housing as well. I think that we need to think about as a society about how we're going to set up locations for individuals who are neurodivergent or who have special needs to be able to engage in independent living or semi-independent living scenarios, where maybe we start to build apartment complexes that are specifically geared toward neurodivergent individuals. That's my dream, at least, for the world, is that eventually somebody's going to start to set these things up so that individuals can have a little of their own freedom and independence, which I think is critical. I just saw a video recently of a family that they put a tiny house. They had a large property with their house on it, and then in a lot in the backyard, they put a tiny house there. And these are becoming pretty popular. A lot of the younger generation actually likes these sort of nice, tiny house. Everything you need is kind of in its right place, and there's no waste. They're very energy efficient and green, if you will. And so this family had done this for their adult son. And the video was him. It was just kind of a fun video where he was walking out of his tiny house. He does this every morning, and he walks over to his parents' house, which is not more than 20, 30, 40 feet away, because he likes to get into their ice machine and get their ice. He has an ice maker, but he prefers the ice over at his parents' house. So that's kind of the first time they see him every day is when he wakes up and he comes over for his morning ice, which is nice because then he gets to go back to his place and be independent. But also, if he needs anything, he's on site with his family. And so that can be a clever and creative way of promoting independent living too. Another thing would be to consult with a developmentalist like myself, a developmental psychologist, a pediatric psychologist, somebody who can assess independent living skills too. And we have some readiness checklists and things that are available. You might even be able to Google some of these where and it's pretty insightful, even if you don't have a child with special needs and you have a child who's maybe getting ready to go off to college. These are great checklists to really determine like how much we kind of lose track as adults, how much we scaffold our kids, how much we support our kids, how much we do for our kids. And only when they need to do it themselves do we start to realize where there's sort of holes that need to be patched up. And so a checklist like this would assess everything from hygiene independence to maintenance awareness, like knowing how to do basic things like change a light bulb or adjust a thermostat, or maybe clear a leaky drain, or be able to turn off the water behind the toilet tank, for example, if the water starts to overflow, knowing how to plunge. Grocery shopping. I mean, the list goes on, but there's so many different things that are assessed through some of these measures. It can be pretty insightful if you want to try to find one of those or work with a professional who's got, usually most psychologists have a bunch of those on hand to be able to work with families that are looking at more transitions and things. So where do we begin and when should we start? No time like the present. I mean, we should always be sort of thinking about the future, but depending on how old the child is, I mean, we're going to be thinking about it a lot once they get closer to the sort of 15-year-old range. But as they're younger, we tend to kind of think about a year ahead at a time, kind of what we want to do for school next year, living arrangements, all that kind of thing tends to be kind of 1 year at a time. All right. Next one. How do we understand the why behind the behavior? My son is dysregulated so often, and I keep wondering, what am I missing? Can regulating activities still not help regulate my child? Yes, I mean, certainly not every regulating activity regulates every system, and certainly the why behind the behavior is something, that's what I do for a living, as I help families answer the why question. Why is this happening? And then one step further, now that we know why it's happening, once we get to that part, then we say, what are we going to do about it? How can we help? And so if understanding the why of the behavior is also similar to like a functional behavior analysis, an FBA that they can oftentimes do in schools for you, where they're looking at the antecedent, so what happens before a behavior happens, and in this case the behavior would be dysregulation. And what's the consequence of dysregulation? Is it that things are getting destroyed? Is it that we just have a lot of movement and that's kind of disruptive? Is it that we have a lot of sound? There can be a variety of different sort of consequences for dysregulated behavior. But what is triggering it is your question, and that's the A part, that's the antecedent. And a functional behavior analysis would study the child's patterns of behavior in a controlled environment like a school classroom. It's a little harder to do at home, but certainly, yeah, you can have mental health professionals help you with that too. But if you don't have, and I'm sorry because I don't have any other information about this child, so I can maybe assume that we don't have full diagnostic clarification yet. We can also assume too, I hear this often, is the child started to get really ramped up, but nothing had happened. And when I hear that, it's not always something you can see. But there's always something that happened. If a behavior starts to change, something has happened. It doesn't have to be in the individual's environment, however. Something often happens just in the brain. And when you have a dysregulated brain, say in the case of ADHD, you start to get chemical activity that a lot of young children describe to me as, my brain sort of takes over and controls me. And then they start to feel like they've got all this energy, they don't know what to do with it, and then people around them start to get more irritated, frustrated, impatient with them, and that starts to impact self-esteem. And so sometimes dysregulation occurs because it's the brain, plain and simple. But other times it's that maybe the child needs more structure, maybe the child needs more routine, maybe the child needs more boundaries, maybe the child needs more attention. And dysregulation can often happen too, especially in neurodivergent individuals who struggle to self-soothe. and struggle to self-entertain. And we see a lot of that where children are becoming more and more reliant on adults in their lives to co-regulate with them, to be present for them so that they can calm down. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but we don't want that to be a long-term solution. We want that to be right now, especially if the child is young, totally appropriate. But over time, what we're going to have to try to figure out is how we can start to pass the baton or the torch a little bit more to the child, because we're not always going to be available. And we're not always going to be here. And so we need to start to pass some of those tools on and have that child really practice some of that. But a lot of kids become dysregulated because they can't entertain themselves. And those are the kids who complain a lot about boredom and kind of want you to just entertain them. And they're the kids too that if you go and you could have a ton of fun things in your yard or in your house, and they might go and spend less than a minute on each one, and within like 5 or 10 minutes they say, okay, well, I did everything you told me to do, but none of it was that fun, and now here we are again. And so regulating activities can help in some situations, but without understanding the why. So say it's a sensory profile and the child really needs heavy work, what we call a sensory diet, and that's a prescribed approach to using your body in a physical way at certain times of the day for certain amounts of time so that we can regulate ourselves. Oftentimes we do that during transitional periods, coming in from recess at school, before you get in the car for a car trip to school or get on the bus. You do these things, and if it's heavy work that's prescribed to your child, it'll be things like carrying heavy items, maybe loading a backpack full of heavy textbooks or heavy items and putting it on the child and having them walk around the house a few times. Or it can be pulling a wagon that's filled with cinder blocks or something heavy, so it's harder to kind of pull, but it's heavy work. Using a big shop broom to sweep the driveway, or to, sweeping in general, shoveling snow, digging a hole in the yard. I mean, there's so many things you can look at for heavy work. Where it really does help the child. Sometimes even they'll have kids carry like a heavy stack of things like down to the front office as one of their breaks. Can you go deliver this stack of heavy items for me? Or they've got one of those big bins that you can sort of carry that's full, maybe an old milk crate that has things stuffed in it. Usually random things, not important. That's not the point. The point isn't to get that stuff to the office for the other people. They don't even take what's in it out. It's to have the child get that break time. So if you are trying regulating activities that are still not helping regulate the child, then I would dig a little deeper. And if you haven't gotten a more comprehensive assessment done of the child's regulatory profile, you can start with a psychologist or therapist. You can also look at an occupational therapy consult too, because those are two of the specialties and professions that are going to help most when it comes to dysregulation. All right, general thoughts on screen time. Are screens actually regulating for kids? No. They're not, but they give the appearance that they are. And what they do, though, is they make the child or the individual's brain feel content. And that's why, back in the day before we had tablets, we had couch potatoes is what we used to call them. And, it's just kind of like laying there. It's very sedentary. You watch a show, you sort of drift off. But with these screens now, too, with the videos and the attention time and everything else, there's a lot of apparent regulation that happens because the child goes dormant behaviorally for a while. Really, the screen almost functions like a pacifier would for an infant. And so as long as it's on, yes, the child's going to be more still. They're going to be tethered to the device because they're interested and engaged in what they see on the screen. And it's making chemicals released from their brain like dopamine that make them feel happy. And that's why it's very difficult to then get them to stop. And what happens the moment that they have to get off is you see the impact right then and there. You see that this child wasn't regulated. They were just kind of locked in, zoned into the screen. The moment it comes off, you start to see what happens, and you see that dysregulation. Not every brain reacts to that the same way, but you will see that be pretty profound in neurodivergent profiles where individuals who have to stop using a screen become very, very upset. And so what sometimes happens is parents fall into the trap of just give it back to them. And then you basically just keep moving the goalpost down the field farther and farther away to sort of get there. And what I really get concerned about are households where they sort of let children just have the screen as much as they want. And I think a lot of that came out of the COVID era, where a lot of us had no choice, especially if you had really young kids and you were working from home, and young kids weren't being engaged from their school standpoint. And so what did they have to do to keep themselves entertained if they don't have vivid imaginations to be able to make things up and play and have a good time? They ended up on screens and spent months, sometimes years, operating that way. And now I see a lot of families struggling to sort of fix that and correct that. And we see a lot of dysregulation. I tell families often that I don't know that I would be able to stay in business. I own and operate a psychology clinic, if screens weren't so big in kids' lives. I mean, screens are a big reason why we have a lot of dysregulation, why we have a lot of depression, why we have a lot of anxiety, why we have a lot of difficulty engaging in academic material or being social, is that screens kind of rob individuals of the opportunities to interact and engage with the world. Screens are supposed to be an adjunct. They're supposed to make our lives a little bit more enjoyable for entertainment purposes, but also could give us a wealth of knowledge and information if we use them properly. But unfortunately, when you just get into a passive relationship with it, where you're just sort of soaking up all the content of what they're feeding you, we start to see they become less regulated. And over time, too, the mood starts to go down and plummet over time. And what else do we see? We see the attention span gone. And what I'm seeing too, and I just saw a very, I think the person was on the news too, a teacher who just went viral for quitting. This is a young female teacher, where she ended up just saying, I can't do this anymore. I can't be a teacher, because she said that the attention span of the children, and this isn't children with ADHD, this is just in general, is so low. The willingness of children to, do the work is very low. And also, like, kids are starting to use things like AI, ChatGPT, whatever, to, according to this teacher, to just, they're not reading. People are reading to them, or they're using audio or other things. And so they show up to school oftentimes. They don't have that foundational knowledge of even alphabet awareness or things like that, phonetic awareness. And from a teacher standpoint, it's like they're starting to report like they can't be responsible for all of it. They can't teach the child and also teach the child all their manners and how to pay attention and how to regulate and those kinds of things. And so we're going to have to take a real hard look at ourselves as parents, and what are we doing, or how are we helping or hindering our kids when we're trying to, as they're growing up and we're trying to enroll them in school. Are we aware of everything they're going to need to hit the ground running once they get there? According to a lot of teachers, they're not ready. They don't have attentional control. They don't have emotional control. They don't have behavioral control. And it's really not the school's responsibility to get all of those things up and running. It's really the school's responsibility to provide an education for the child. Without those other things where they need to be, though, that's almost an impossible task. And so we're starting to see a lot of frustrated teachers who then report that to families. But then if the families fight back and are annoyed with the teacher, then we're getting nowhere. So going back to the general thoughts on screen time, yes, we live in a world where screens are everywhere. Yes, children are going to have access to screens. And yes, children need to learn how to interact and engage with screens, but also need to know how to come off of those screens. And we have to be really careful as parents if we are just freely giving them access, or when they are really having a rage episode because they can't have it, or because they're told or asked to stop having it to do something else. We have to take a real hard look at that and really make some tough decisions as far as how we're going to approach these screens in the future, as far as accessibility and what sort of behaviors are expected if this child wants to continue to have access to those screens. So these are really great questions, everyone, and I apologize because there's a lot more. We're gonna extend those, and every week we don't get to the questions. They'll just be they'll be open for the following Q&A session. So thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. I'm pediatric psychologist Dr. Mark Bowers.